Okay. So it may be a book that you're interested in getting. If you feel you've really enjoyed this first session after, you may want to join us for more sessions. If I have enough interest, I'll do some more group sessions. There's 12 total. They're usually $30 a session. They're an hour and a half each. There's worksheets and handouts and things that go along with it. And after this session, I'll actually send you a worksheet that kind of goes along with it, so you can kind of get an idea of what the curriculum looks like, and you're welcome to use that and fill that out. That would be something that usually we would kind of go over in the next session and talk about, was like the homework that goes with it. And we usually start kind of the introduction in chapter 1 in the book after this session. So that's kind of what that is. It's usually about $12 on Amazon. So pretty reasonable, and I'm sure you can probably get it local as well at Barnes & Noble or a local bookstore. And that would be great to support local stores as well. So we usually kind of start with a video clip from Brene Brown that goes with the curriculum. I've usually been doing kind of clips on YouTube, but I'm going to try to do the DVD today and see how that works. I was kind of reviewing over it before. So we'll just kind of start on that. It's about 25 minutes, but it's a great introduction of her work and how she kind of came across this and built this curriculum and some of the important key points of this curriculum. So you're welcome to take notes if you want. It's a great video. So we'll kind of start with that. I'm going to share the screen, see how this works here. Okay.
My name is Brene Brown, and I am a shame and empathy researcher at University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. I am the author of I Thought It Was Just Me, Women.
Okay, I'm going to pause it for a second. How do I? Okay. I just want to make sure, did everybody kind of hear that okay? If there's any problems, let me know if you can't hear it. Okay.
And reclaiming power and courage in a culture of shame. So when I first started this work, I was so excited to finally get an understanding of shame and what it meant and why so many of us have turned over big parts of our lives to it. So when I first started the work, I was really passionate about talking about what is it and how does it work. I wanted to explain to people, here's what I'm learning about shame. Here's how it works in our lives. Because the thing probably a year into this research, I knew 3 things. 1, we've all got it. 2, no one wants to talk about it. And 3, the less we talk about it, the more power we turn over to it. So in the beginning, I really focused on the what is shame and how does it work? What is empathy? How does it work? And as I would talk to people, I started to hear the why question more than any other question. People were interested in the what is it and how does it work? But what people really wanted to know is why. Why are you studying this? And why are you insisting that we talk about this? Because, the truth is, these are tough topics. When you tell people that you study shame, vulnerability, and empathy, they kind of look at you like, wow, were all the other topics taken? Or did you draw the short straw in research school? But that's not the case. So people, and that's a mindful question. Why do you study this, and why do you think we should talk about it? And so that's where I like to start. And what's interesting about my answer is that when I could not have answered the question, why shame and empathy? 6 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago. But now, after talking to hundreds of men and women around the country about shame and how it affects the way they live, love, parent, work, build relationships, I finally, for the first time and probably in my career, understand why. If you think about connection, and I talk a lot about connection in my work, connection is our ability to forge meaningful, authentic relationships with other people. I believe that connection is the essence of the human experience. It is what breathes life into our lives. If you think about connection on a continuum, what I have learned is that anchoring this into that continuum is empathy. It is what moves us toward deep, meaningful relationship. On the other side of the continuum connection is shame. It absolutely unravels our relationships and our connections with other people. And so to study shame and empathy and to ask people to engage in a national conversation about these things just for the sake of knowing shame and empathy, I think it might be too big of a question, too big of a favor to ask people to talk about it just for that sake. But what I have learned is that if we want to understand connection, if we want to understand what really fills our human spirit, we have to understand what anchors those into that continuum. The vulnerability piece is, if you imagine this continuum almost like an equalizer on a stereo, and it has a little knob that you can move, that knob is vulnerability. When we are in our best vulnerability, meaning open, willing to share not only our strengths with people, but our struggles, that moves us towards empathy. Empathy is about being vulnerable with people in their vulnerability. It's about being with folks. If you slide that knob on continuum, over to shame, that vulnerability is worse. That's when I can't let you see a piece of me because I fear that it will cause disconnection. Three of the big questions I want to answer in my research, where shame and vulnerability and empathy are central, have to do with courage, compassion, and connection. And so I'd like to kind of go through each of those. The first one is courage. When courage first came into the English language, it had a very simple definition. It comes from the Latin word cur, which means heart. And courage meant to speak your mind with your heart, to tell your story. I think over time that definition has changed in terms of the way we use it. But if you think about courage, and I use the term ordinary courage, which I read in an article by Annie Rogers. If you think about ordinary courage, telling our story, how do we do that in a culture of fear? Shame breeds three things: fear, blame, and disconnection. So how do we practice courage in a culture where we are incredibly afraid of not fitting in? How do I tell you my story about those imperfect moments in my life, about the time when I was just not the mom that I wanted to be, about the time where I really screwed up at work and I lost the client, that I have a partner who's deep into addiction and I'm afraid for people to know because I don't want them to stop caring about my partner or question my judgment in terms of being with him or her. How do I tell these stories, which is the only way that we get out from underneath shame, in a culture where belonging and fitting in and being accepted are so critically important? So we're in this culture right now. What hasn't changed for us as people is the fact that we're wired for story. From the beginning of human time, we are wired to tell our story. We're not born to keep our secrets. We're not born, hating things about us and not sharing them with other people. We're born to tell our story. So it's not people who have changed, it's the culture that's changed. And so how do we embrace and share the imperfections that make us who we are in a culture where we're afraid to not fit in? The second piece is compassion, and that is really in an important way related to stories, because stories are only a form of connection when someone's listening and hearing us. So how do we have the courage to tell our stories? But then where do we find the compassion to hear other people's stories? You know, one thing that's real important to understand about shame is that while it's universal and all of us have it, it's triggered for all of us in very different ways. Maybe for me it's about body image or parenting or sex or addiction. For someone else it might be about providing, money, aging, religion. One thing that's universal about it is just listening to shame can be shaming for us. So if you were to share your story with me, how do I stay open and sit in that with you, as opposed to moving into blame and judgment? Pema Chodron, who is a wonderful writer, she is an American Buddhist nun, talks about compassion in her work as knowing your darkness well enough that you can sit in the darkness with others. And one of the things she points out in her work is being compassionate is never a relationship between the healed and the wounded. It is a relationship between equals. I can sit with you in your vulnerability, and that's kind of the word I use in my work. She uses darkness. I can sit with you in your vulnerability, not because I'm there to take care of you, but because I know my vulnerability. I know my imperfection, and so while you're in yours, while you're in your struggle, I'll be with you in it. And so how do we practice compassion in a culture where we move to blame? We are so, one of the things that's been very interesting about the interviewing is when people tell me, I finally got the courage to tell my neighbor who's known me for 10 years, I was a drug addict. And then what my neighbor does is all of a sudden I see her disengaging, wondering if maybe she could still keep, should she still keep sending her kids over to play at my house, even though they've been playing there for 5 years. Now all of a sudden, I'm this thing that comes with all these stereotypes and myths. There's no compassion. There's no, hey, thank you for sharing that struggle with me. There's just, now I've reduced you. So how can we maintain compassion and really hear people? And that's a part of empathy. That's a part of reaching out and being with people in a way that says, I'm imperfect too. I feel you. It's not feeling for someone, it's feeling with someone. And we can't feel with people if we can't touch the place in ourselves that it's imperfect and fearful. The last piece, so we've got how do we practice courage in a culture of fear? And I want to go back to compassion for a minute, because there's one reason why I think we move to blame. And that is, as a culture, we are hungry for accountability. We blame people for their experiences because we want to hold people accountable. We say, I can't be compassionate when I hear this story because that person needs to be held accountable. If you raged at your child and screamed and yelled and you did something that I feel like was inappropriate with your child, you don't deserve my compassion. I'm going to blame you for that. That's bad parenting. And that's such a good example, because parenting is just a minefield of shame and judgment and blame. What I've learned in this research is that accountability and blame are mutually exclusive. And that's really hard for people to get their heads around. And let me give you an example. I interviewed a woman who she told me that for her, shame was every time she went to her mom's house to visit. She'd moved out of state. She could only visit with her husband and kids. Her mom would open the door, come out in the driveway, and say, "Oh my God, you're still fat. We talked about this the last time you were here. When are you going to lose weight?" And as you can imagine, this woman would just sink in shame. Not only was this mother, saying this to her in this really painful way, she was doing it in front of her husband, in front of her kids. And so when I asked her, how do you deal with this? How do you handle it? She said, well, my sister and I tell my mom, lay off, get off our backs. Her favorite line was, where do you think we get these butts from, Miss America? She would just rage and blame and attack. And after she started doing the shame resilience work, what she realized is that when we blame, we often let people off the hook. Because if we want to hold people accountable, we have to be real about how we're feeling and what we need. What she ended up doing is she ended up sitting down with her mom one day and saying, I'm so excited, driving down our old street, pulling up in the driveway. I can't wait to see you. Get out of the car, screen door opens, you come out, and the first thing you say to me is, oh my God, you're still fat. We talked about that. You break my heart. I feel so ashamed. I can barely breathe. I can't believe you say that to me. I can't believe you say it in front of my husband and my kids. It is so painful for me. I cannot keep doing that. Either we can talk about this and figure out what's going on, and if you're not willing to do that, that's okay. No more comments about my weight. You've got to stop doing it. That's accountability. But you can see in that story that when we hold people accountable, it takes vulnerability on our end. It takes saying, you hurt me. This is painful for me. I interviewed this young woman interestingly, I ended up interviewing her and then a man that worked for her same company. And their boss actually had erasable whiteboards, two of them outside his cubicle. One of them said winner's list, and the other one said loser's list. And based on their output, he would move people in his team from the winner's list to the loser's list. And what she said to me was that she was on the winner's list for the first year she worked there. Her accounts were great. She made a lot of money for her company. And then, inevitably, she screwed up, as we all do, and got moved to the loser's list. And she didn't even know what was happening as it was happening. But she started missing work. She started messing up even more. And as it turns out, she was in deep shame. And what happened was, when she was at this place where that place sucks, and this boss is the meanest guy in the world, and this is ridiculous, when she was in this place of blame and anger, she couldn't get to the accountability piece. But when she finally figured out what was going on, and she was able to say, when you shame me in front of my colleagues, when you attack who I am as a person, you shut me down. I can't keep coming back here every day and being my best self when I feel ashamed of who I am. I'm not a winner when I'm doing things great, and I'm not a loser when I make a mistake. But again, blame and accountability, blame is about discharging pain and anger. Accountability is about understanding how vulnerable we feel, expressing that, and asking for what we need. The last piece I want to talk about is connection. And the question here is, how do we practice connection in a culture of disconnection? We may have instant messaging, Blackberries, trios. I can't go 5 steps without getting some kind of ring or buzzer from somebody. That's communicating. That's not connecting. We may live in a highly, communication available world. We live in a disconnected world. People ask me all the time, isn't it hard to hear all these stories about people struggle with shame? And what I've come to realize about my work is that's not the hard part. For me, that's the human part. For me, in some really meaningful way, hearing people's stories, those stories of imperfection and shame connected to our humanity. It's what makes us kind of all the same in the final analysis. What's hard for me as a researcher is hearing how isolated and alone and disconnected people feel. What I wish I could do is I wish I could keep a list of everyone I interview, from coast to coast. And then when people say, here's what I'm up against, I get a credit card bill every month and my husband's spending $500 on internet porn, and it's because I'm fat and ugly, and that's what he wants to do, and he's picking them over me. I wish I could whip out my list and say, here are the other, 300 people I talk to that are up against the same thing. It's not just you. Yeah, that's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I assure you, your husband's not supporting it alone. And it's not your husband and a bunch of gross people. It's a bunch of normal people looking, hate to quote Billy, but looking for love in all the wrong places. And it's not even looking for love; it's looking for connection. And so, how do we get reconnected in a culture where everyone feels so disconnected? If I would have said 5 years ago that we are wired for connection, that could have sounded kind of, new agey, woohoo, machine researcher. When I say we're wired for connection today, I could back a truck up with neurobiological data that, that evidences the fact that we are hardwired at a cellular level for connection. We are emotionally wired, intellectually wired, cognitively wired, some of us spiritually wired for connection. As children, from newborn through maybe late elementary school, connection equals survival. We have no one in our lives to connect with. We don't survive as babies anymore. So we are hardwired for connection. I think a great way to think about shame is the shame is the fear of disconnection. It is the fear that something about who we are, something we've done, something we failed to do, maybe something that happened to us, makes us so flawed that we don't deserve to belong and be accepted and be in connection. And so what we need to figure out is how do we start connecting with each other in a way that moves us through this culture of disconnection. And one of the things that, people ask a lot is, I talk about in my work the culture of fear, the culture of blame, the culture of disconnection. Aren't we up against these big things that how do we, I can change me, or I can try to change me, and maybe I can even try to change my family. But how are we going to fix and repair these cultures that seem to be broken? And I want to quote Mary Piper because she said something about cultural change that I believe is absolutely true and bears out if you look at history. Dr. Piper says that cultural change is a million individual acts of courage and kindness. To change the culture doesn't mean to topple big systems. It means to make choices every day in our lives to practice courage, to tell our story, to be brave enough to practice compassion and be able to hear struggle in others, and to start being connected. One of the things we do in a culture of fear and blame and disconnection is we have a tendency to steamroll over the important people in our lives in order to get the approval of the people out there who really don't matter. The strangers at the mall who, we want to look great in front of, the other parents on the soccer field, the guy at work who just rubs us the wrong way. in the end, I'm not sure that those are the people that matter. If we have one or two people in our lives who embrace us and love us for not just our strengths but our struggles, that's where we do this work. And so I'm really grateful for all the people who stopped me along the way in my work and said, okay, we want to hear about the what is shame and how does it work, and we want to know what is empathy and how does it work. But the people who said, why? Why do you study this, and why are you so passionately convinced that we need to talk about this? Because maybe the why question is the bigger question. And the invitation to talk about shame and vulnerability and empathy is a hard invitation for people. It's asking people to look at some stuff that we all have and that we've all been socialized and taught not to talk about. But I think with the why question answers is if we can do it, I think we can move from fear to courage, and we can move from blame to compassion, and we can move from disconnection.
Okay. So that was kind of the video introduction. She talks about three main things, which are courage, right? Compassion and connection. So those are big things with shame resilience. So I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to bring that up. Okay. Share the screen again to the PowerPoint. Okay. So we kind of went over group rules, so this is just kind of a review there. Okay, so some main points from the video is why we need to understand shame and empathy, and then practicing courage in a culture of fear, practicing compassion in a culture of blame, and practicing connection in a culture of disconnection. So as you kind of saw, we all need connection, right? Connection is a human need, and shame is that fear of disconnection. So it keeps us from the very thing that we need most, right? So as she kind of says, right, we all experience shame, everybody, right? No one really wants to talk about it, and sometimes no one really knows how to talk about it, right? But the less we don't talk about it, right? I mean, the less we talk about it, right? The more we don't talk about it, the more power it has, the shame. And it kind of keeps everything almost like in a hidden state, right? It wants that secrecy and everything like that. So it's related to the human experience because we all need connection. Brene describes connection as our ability to forge meaningful, authentic relationships with other people, and it gives meaning to our lives. So if you think of kind of like this continuum, right, with shame on one side and empathy and connection on the other side, and then vulnerability is kind of like that dial, right? So the more vulnerable we are, the more we're closer to connection and empathy. And the less vulnerable we are, turning it down, right, we're in that shame. And then courage is the ability to speak your mind with your heart, okay, to tell your story. And this is a really important aspect in becoming resilient to shame, okay, having that courage and being able to tell our story and be able to listen to others' story. So shame breeds fear, blame, and disconnection, right? And it's hard to practice courage in a culture where we fear not belonging. We want to belong, we want to be connected, but yet we fear that we're not going to be long. And so it can be really hard, but practicing that courage is something that gets us out of that shame. So she says, even though it's hard, right? It's the only way to get out of shame is to be able to tell our stories. And the interesting thing about that is we're so scared to tell our story, but it's interesting how when we do tell our story, how it connects us and people actually feel more connected to us. And um, it just, even though it's scary, it can be a way to feel human with each other. Not always, right? There's sometimes where you tell your story and you are shamed, right? But oftentimes it actually makes us feel more real and more connected to people when they're able to show that vulnerability with us. And then compassion, right? The second one that she talks about is the act of truly hearing someone else's story. So stories are that form of connection when people are really hearing us. And though shame is universal, it's triggered in different ways. It can be hard to stay open while listening to someone else's shame. And compassion is a capacity to sit with other people in their vulnerability when they're sharing their shame without moving to blame, judgment, or advice giving, right? And sometimes when we are hearing someone else's story, we can be triggered, right? And we need to be able to be aware of those triggers and our own shame so that we can be there with them in their vulnerability. So in our culture, we tend to confuse blame with holding someone accountable. And she kind of talked about that in the video and those differences, that they're not the same. That you can still be compassionate and empathetic with someone while holding them accountable for their actions. But blaming a person only isolates that person, right? It almost, like she says, it takes them off the hook, right? It's not like a direct holding someone for accountable. It's not really changing anything that they did or what you felt, right? We need to be able to share our story, and it's okay to hold people accountable so that we can work through the shame and change that story for ourselves. And then the last thing is connection occurs when we listen empathetically as someone else communicates. Stories of imperfection and shame actually connect us, right? We are hardwired at a cellular level for connection. And that shame is that fear of disconnection. When we feel shame, we feel that something about us makes us so flawed that we don't deserve to be in connection with other people. Most people in our culture feel very disconnected. We feel a lot of shame. What do you, any thoughts so far on kind of everything? Okay, I'm going to continue on. So shame is basic. It's a universal experience across all cultures. We see it in all kinds of cultures across the United States, cultures in other countries, religious cultures, social cultures, right? We experience shame daily in our culture, and our culture sends continuous shaming messages. So, for example, we accuse mothers of not doing what's best for their children. We accuse women of not looking good enough. We accuse men of being weak. Um, can you guys think of any examples from society of shame? If anybody wants to share.
Do you want us to just speak up?
Yeah, just speak up.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
great. It's okay.
I'm a little confused about the shame. My therapist
Okay.
had recommended this.
Yeah.
Mine is not so much shame as the self-loathing. So
Mm-hmm.
explain to me the difference between the shame and the self-loathing. I don't mean to take us back from what your question was,
Okay.
but I
Okay.
can give you examples of what you're asking now. But please explain that to me before we go on.
Yeah. I think, well, shame can come from other people, but it can also come from ourselves. The self-loathing is us kind of like shaming ourselves, right? And being stuck in some of that
Right.
negative self-attacking. So by kind of understanding what shame is and how it affects us, um, and some of those expectations that kind of drive shame, which kind of as the curriculum goes on, you learn more a little bit
Okay,
about
because
like what
this,
those
yeah,
expectations are and kind of shame categories and different things. You'll probably kind of start to understand more how that relates to like your self-loathing and that type of thing.
okay, because this shaming's this first concept that I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
Um, on Monday when I went to go check voicemails for work,
Mm-hmm.
a patient had called up and left a message, "You're effing fat.
Wow.
Quit eating."
Wow.
And he's shaming me.
Oh, big time. Yeah.
So that would be an example.
That would be an example. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. So that's something in society, right? Is people's
Yeah.
weight or that we relate that, oh, they must be eating a
Are
lot,
you ready?
you know, and
Some
that
tea and
usually
coffee.
actually doesn't, it's not the big
I
story of
was really
why
had high
people,
hopes for this, but it's awful.
yeah, that's very hurtful and harmful. Um, so another thing in society um, is that we try to use shame to teach people to reinforce or control behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but shame only makes people feel rejected, diminished, and ridiculed.
Mm-hmm.
Causes damage and only teaches us to feel alone, right? That's shaming people doesn't really teach them anything or change behavior or really do anything positive. It does damage. And so if we're not going to be able to change that shame happens. You know, we can somewhat try to kind of change that in society, and we can change how we shame other people or how we shame ourselves. But it's really the ability not necessarily to stop shaming, right? Um, it will tend to happen, but it's becoming resilient to that. And so in that way, it's changing it for ourselves and for others around us, really. So in her book that I know some of you might have kind of missed the first part, but this is the book that we use with the group. It's her first book. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. So we use it, we read it along with doing the group. So in there, she describes shame. I'm going to like minimize this. So it's intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. Okay, and I love how she describes it because it really, really defines it so well. And it's interesting because we don't always recognize shame, right? We don't always recognize what it is or know how to talk about it. And that's why I love this curriculum, is because it helps us to start to understand shame and how to start talking about it. And that's been a great thing. I mean, even in like my own experience going through this, is realizing my own shame right now, as well as kind of the past things will come up, you know, as I've done this work, and just that realization of that's what that was. It was shame. That's what I was stuck in, and I didn't realize, and it kept me stuck for years after that happened. And now being able to start to realize that and work through that in a different way, it's been really beneficial. And that's part of why I love this curriculum. Okay. So ultimately, shame isolates one person from another. So it disconnects people, right? In fact, shame can be thought of as that fear of disconnection. Because people want to be connected, they feel desperate when they feel shame. They're desperately afraid of being disconnected. So her three things, the courage, compassion, and connection, help us to overcome experiences of shame. And they help us to become resilient to shame. And ultimately, connection heals shame. And then empathy is a big thing too in this curriculum, that empathy is the ability to put ourselves in another's place. Empathy is essential to creating the connection that shame breaks. And sometimes that's even empathy in our own place, if that kind of makes sense, is being able to work through our experience in a different way. So then there's some things that are somewhat related to shame, but they're a little bit different. And so we're going to kind of go through those to kind of describe those, because sometimes we get them confused with shame. So that's embarrassment, guilt, and humiliation. Okay. So embarrassment is that fleeting, it's kind of normal, everybody experiences it. Sometimes it can eventually become funny as we look back on it. We know that embarrassing experience is something that other people have had, and so that makes it a little bit more bearable. Okay? And so it's not quite as deep as shame happens, it's not very exciting, but we're able to kind of get over it, and it's not as deeply held within us. And then guilt is actually motivating. When we feel guilty, we feel that we did something wrong that we can correct in the future. As opposed to shame, we feel that not necessarily we did something wrong, but that we are wrong. There's something wrong with us. Okay, so it goes a lot deeper, where guilt can kind of be that compass to test across our values. And it's okay, I made a mistake, but I can kind of correct that or do something different. I can study more or do something about it, right? And then humiliation feels really bad, right? But it actually can make us angry because it's something that someone does to us. So when we feel humiliated, we feel that we don't really deserve the experience. Where shame, we actually feel a sense of that we deserve it. So shame, in contrast to these, is that feeling that we are fundamentally flawed and deserve to feel small and inadequate. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. I'm going to kind of go back. Okay, we're good on time. So usually in the group, we're like sharing and talking a lot more. So that's time wise. We're kind of on the end of the PowerPoint. So I'll send everybody who registered and came today a worksheet. It's called Defining Shame. And so just kind of ask some questions. So that will be kind of healing to start to kind of go through. If you do want to continue in this series, just let me know. If I have enough people, I'll kind of start a group and we'll continue on in the series. There's also the book to start reading. Whether you want to continue or not, it's a great book. It's great material. If you don't want to continue, you can even, go through the worksheet with your therapist or people that you care about. So it's a good kind of material to go through. I'm going to stop sharing that. Okay. So any thoughts or kind of questions so far? Let's kind of talk a little bit about the shame thing. What do you think makes it so hard to talk about with shame? Any kind of ideas from personal experiences?
Just the fact that it is shame.
Yeah, right. And it wants us to be there, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't have anything good to say. Like, I'm yeah, there's something wrong with me. Like, no one wants to hear from me. How do I talk about this, right? And sometimes having the right words to know, like, how do I even talk about this? Like, what are the words for this? And yeah, that can be very hard. And that fear of not belonging or fear of being judged if I share this vulnerability with other people, right? Yeah. So, see, I was gonna try to maybe I'll bring up, can share what the kind of the outline of this whole curriculum kind of looks like, so you can kind of get a better idea. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to share this. Okay, so the first session obviously is that kind of an introduction. The second one, we kind of go an overview of the whole curriculum. So in the second one, we'd usually kind of go through this and then defining more of what shame is. And then the third one, we talk about big webs and small boxes. So that's kind of how it relates to men and women, how we get in these webs of shame or these boxes of shame. Even though shame affects men and women equally, right? We experience shame in different ways. So we kind of start to talk about that in those different ways and what that looks like. And then number 4, we start to define what resilience is, and then what practicing empathy means, which is something that gets us out of shame, okay? And then 5, we kind of continue that practicing empathy and what that looks like. And then in 6, we start to learn how to start to recognize shame more in ourselves and other people. And then 7, we start to explore our own triggers and vulnerabilities to shame. And then 8, understanding our shame screens. So we kind of learn what those are. And then 9, practicing critical awareness. We learn what that is and how to do it. And then 10 is reaching out, and then 11 is speaking shame, and then 12 is that authenticity and shame resilience. So being authentic to ourselves and who we are, and building that shame resilience. So kind of that last one. And so we have a lot of handouts and worksheets. Some worksheets we do during the session, and some are homework that we do on our own, and then we can share in the next session. And then of course we read the book that goes along with it, because everything's in the book too. So like there's like shame webs here in the book. So everything we talk about is also in the book. So it's great resource, and she tells a lot of stories and things which helps make it come to life more and understand the material more. And then doing the worksheets and things really helps us to start to dig deeper and ask those questions and understand our own shame. So that's kind of a little bit more about the material that kind of helps that. So any other thoughts or questions on shame for me today that could be helpful? Okay, so that's kind of all the material I have. I wasn't sure for how long it would take. Usually the groups are about an hour and a half, but of course we are in a group and we're doing a little bit more discussion and things. I think we have a chat here. Yeah. So thank everybody for joining me, and hopefully this is helpful. I'll send that worksheet over to everybody via your email. Of course, if you have any other questions for me, you're welcome to contact me. And if you're interested in group, let me know. And if I have enough people, then we'll do a group. Let me know kind of what day. If Saturday works great, we'll do Saturday. Just kind of let me know what daytime works best for you, and we'll try to form a group if there's enough people. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully this was helpful to start to kind of talk about shame and know a little bit more about it. So thank you, and we'll see everyone later.